Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Marty Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, also known as Sha Po Lang by Priest, and we're covering chapters 40 through 42. So without further ado, I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 40, Hunting Monkeys. Upon the mountain's peak, a large flag was slowly hoisted into the air. At first glance, it appeared to be the banner for yet another apricot blossom village, but when the wind unfurled it fully, the words Apricot Grove became clear. The figures of numerous mountain bandits, large and small, showed themselves from their hidden places behind trees and foliage. All wore crude homemade armor and stood with arrows nocked and pointed at the group at the foot of the mountain. Silver flashed on the slopes above. When Chang Geng squinted upward, he spied a suit of heavy armor, stolen from who knows where, standing at the mountain's peak. The face of the person in the armor was concealed beneath their visor, but they stood out in the open like a target waiting to be hit. Chang Geng almost wanted to laugh at this gang of highwaymen who had managed to set their sights on the Marquis of Order. But when he turned around, he found that Gu Yuan wasn't smiling at all. Far from it. His expression was frighteningly dark, and he squeezed one word from between his teeth. Fools. Chang Geng did a quick mental calculation, then lowered his voice. So it's not just a rumor that the southern border officials are colluding with bandits? It's actually true? Gu Yuan didn't speak, but his face grew still more grim. For as long as there had been a Great Liang dynasty, the local specialty of the East Sea had been pearls, the local specialty of Lowlan had been fine wine, and the local specialty of the southern border had been mountain bandits. Due to the deployment of the farming puppets in recent years, farmers could no longer find work. Some joined the itinerant merchants and went north to make a living, while others decided for incomprehensible reasons to turn to crime and join the mountain bandits in the south. Goods were becoming cheaper and cheaper, so silver seemed more and more valuable in comparison. Fewer people kept stores of goods and grain, and more began to keep stores of gold and silver instead. This, in turn, greatly increased the efficiency of the mountain bandits' robberies. The culture of banditry flourished here, and the bandits' nests outnumbered even those of the wild hares. They were like prairie grass, ineradicable by wildfire and shooting up again with every spring breeze. It didn't help that the Ministry of War treated the Southern Border Army like an unwanted stepchild. The Army's funding was never enough, and they had no way to keep up with the bandits. Yet, though the bandits had the advantage in numbers, their abilities in battle were limited. In the face of a proper army, their nests would fall one by one, so they were still wary of the local garrisons. Once a person came into money, they would naturally pursue peace and stability. No one wanted to spend their days getting chased around, constantly at risk of having their heads struck from their necks, and bandits were people too. Thus, as time went on, the Southern Bandit Army and the local bandits developed a curious symbiosis. Fu Zhicheng, the commanding general of the Southern Border Army, had started out as a bandit in the first place. On the surface, he strived to keep the bandits in check and ensure they took only money and not lives. But what was this if not a method of shielding them? And with the Southern Border Army in dire financial straits year after year, tributes from the local bandits had played no small part in their ability to scrape by all this time. Collusion between officials and bandits was nothing to be proud of, but Gu Yuan understood the ins and outs of the situation. Over the past few years, the emperor had implemented farming puppets and thrown the gates open to new trade routes. Both were good policies that should have enriched the nation and strengthened its people, but for some reason, the national treasury didn't fill up. It emptied instead, and military funding was reduced once again. And now, the South had been struck by floods and had yet to receive disaster relief. If fighting between the army and the bandits were to start on top of everything else, the common people's suffering would only intensify as bandits scuttled through every city and town. And even if the court wanted to appoint a new commander-in-chief to the southern border army due to Fu Zhicheng's indiscretions, Gu Yuan couldn't think of a single person other than General Fu who could keep the southern border under control. Caught between two evils, Gu Yuan chose the lesser of them. It was hardly a choice at all. He had to find a way to protect Fu Zhicheng for the time being. In a few more years, when the constructions of the Silk Road was complete and Great Liang's inland trade routes were fully opened, silver would flow in from overseas, and the nation could catch its breath. When that time came, not only would Gu Yuan mobilize troops, he'd build a proper road from the Bashu region to the southern border and strengthen government supervision over this far-away region where the emperor's control was weak. Only with this two-pronged approach could the bandit scourge be brought under control once and for all. Unfortunately, none but he seemed to understand the situation, leaving Gu Yuan to worry on his own. Or perhaps it wasn't that they didn't understand, but that to them, the marching orders decree and future opportunities to kiss the emperor's ass for power and money were more important than the stability of the region. Gu Yuan had spent the entire way here pondering how to protect Fu Zhicheng. He had even sent him a secret missive, only for the general to pull this move on him before he'd even reached his destination. What gang of bandits emptied their whole lair for a highway robbery, and even showed up with flag flying and drums beating? They clearly knew who he was. What difference was there between violently intercepting an imperial envoy of the court and outright insurrection? Chang Geng had spent these years down among the people as he traveled the world. He had a good grasp on the current political climate as well as the everyday concerns of the populace. With some thought, the general outline of the situation became clear. He glanced at Gu Yuan's face, then said under his breath, "Yifu, I think this may not entirely be General Fu's intent." "No kidding," Gu Yuan said coldly. "Since when was Fu Zhicheng this stupid?" These bandits who declared themselves king of the mountain likely recognized a handful of characters at most. If they wanted someone who could write and do sums, multiple peaks would have to share a single accountant. Perhaps these bandits had heard rumors leaked from somewhere or other and decided to act on their own. They'd intercepted Gu Yuan as both a test and a threat, so they could later go to Fu Zhicheng and brag about their accomplishments. Unfortunately, they were idiots, and if their idiocy wasn't handled properly, responsibility for this incident was likely to fall directly on Fu Zhicheng's head. High up on the mountain, a bandit raised a crude copper squall, bellowing at Gu Yuan's party down below like he was singing lines in an opera. "Who goes there? Identify yourselves!" Next to them, Shun Yi seemed torn between laughter and tears as he drew an arrow from his quiver. "Sir." "Shoot him down," Gu Yuan ground out. Shun Yi's arrow leapt from its string the instant Gu Yuan's words left his mouth, piercing the bandit with the copper squall like a hot knife through lard. A startled bird squawked as it shot into the sky, its cry echoing through the mountain pass. The valley exploded. Minister Sun had no chance to rejoice that he'd grasped some leverage against Fu Zhicheng, as he was too busy being scared stiff. He tumbled from the carriage, babbling, You mustn't, Marshal, you mustn't. There's at least 100 bandits in those mountains. We only have a handful of people with us, and no one is wearing armor. We're practically defenseless. And the fourth prince, the fourth prince is of noble status. We can't let anything happen." Gu Yuan didn't deign to look at the man as he waved Chang Geng over. "Your Highness, have you been keeping up with your training?" Chang Geng said with a bow. "I should at least be qualified to serve as a modest cavalryman under the marshal's command. Come, I'll teach you how to hunt monkeys in the mountains." Gu Yuan spurred his horse straight up the slope, and Chang Geng followed without hesitation. The seasoned Black Iron Battalion soldiers understood their commander's intent the instant Gu Yuan moved and urged their horses to follow. Minister Sun was left in their dust, his screams lingering in the air behind him. "Marshal, you mustn't!" Someone snagged the back of his collar, lifting him bodily off the ground. Shun Yi hoisted the minister up with his sword hilt and tossed him onto the back of his own horse. Sun Jiao let out a squeak, and his eyes rolled back in his head at the impact. Minister Sun, stop yelling. This humble general will preserve your life. Never fear, Shen Yi said in exasperation. He glanced at Minister Sun, who had fainted dead away, whites of his eyes showing. This is the first time I've seen an assistant minister who seems so much like a eunuch. On the mountain's peak, a young bandit turned to his chief. Dage, I heard that eunuch yelling, Marshal. Entombed inside the heavy armor, the bandit chief pushed the iron visor up and snapped. No shit. If it wasn't a marshal down there, I wouldn't be ordering an attack. Just shoot already. Surround them. Surround them! The call of a horn once again echoed through the valley, and the bandits surged forward in a wave, charging straight toward Gu Yuan's meager forces. Perhaps they'd attempted such a dramatic encirclement in an effort to bolster their courage. One side was already running down the mountain, while the other was still banging pots and pans and yowling on their way over from the opposite peak, their headlong rush kicking clouds of dust up into the air. Unfortunately, most of their horses had been stolen from passing merchant caravans. How could they hope to keep up with the Black Iron Battalion's incomparable war horses? The bandits were quickly left in the dust. Gu Yuan gave a hand signal, and the soldiers following him scattered in all directions. Now that the targets of the bandits' arrows had split, they rapidly lost any semblance of order. Facing the throng of fierce bandits, Gu Yuan dispassionately drew his sword, the blade flashing like snow. Without turning, he said to Chang Geng, Remember this, on the battlefield, whoever clings to life is the first to die. Chang Geng was nearly blinded by that sword. Gu Yuan's blade moved like a soaring dragon, drops of blood splattering in its wake. With a few strikes, the bodies of bandits and horses tumbled to the ground. He smoothly finished his sentence. Even if your enemies aren't worth a damn. High on the peak, the bandit chief gazed down through a field scope. Seeing their plans had gone awry, he roared, I told you to surround them! What's going on? Distress was written across the face of the young bandit next to him. Dage, I don't know. A deeply tanned bandit ran over to report, Dage, it's not looking good. Seconds later, a light cavalryman charged through the gully. The bandit holding the horn didn't even have a chance to shrink his neck back before his head was parted from his body with the flash of a blade. Gu Yuan had outstanding riding skills and could gallop through mountainous terrain like he was riding over a flat plain. As he crossed a narrow mountain path, his sword whipped out in an arc. A blood-curdling scream sounded from behind a large boulder. Someone had been hiding in ambush. Gu Yuan flicked blood from his blade, using this action to give Chang Geng a chance to catch up. There are plenty of obstacles in the mountains, and the local thugs often hide behind them. Even if your martial skills are good, you may not be able to avoid a trap. Scanning the area, Chang Geng saw that a mechanical crossbow had been set up behind that rock, ready to shoot some unsuspecting passers-by. His horse was no godlike battle steed, and he was having some trouble keeping up with Gu Yuan, but he still felt every drop of blood in his body grow warm. Yifu, how did you know? The corner of Gu Yuan's lips curved up in a smile. It's simply a matter of practice. He had hardly finished speaking when a boulder suddenly came loose and rolled down the mountain toward them. Like there were eyes on the top of his head, Gu Yuan dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The warhorse sprang forward as the falling stone practically brushed against its tail. At the same time, Gu Yuan stood up in his saddle, grabbed a nearby vine, and swung through the air, flipping himself up into the canopy. Chang Geng heard a squelching sound and instinctively reared back, narrowly saving himself from getting a face full of blood courtesy of his savage godfather. Gu Yuan raised one eyebrow and smiled down at him from above. He whistled for his horse, and the well-trained animal trotted directly over to him. Chang Geng's heart pounded in his chest. That smile from Gu Yuan had nearly sucked his soul from his body. Gu Yuan called down, When hunting monkeys in the mountains, remember to first take the high ground. By now, the bandits' joke of an encirclement had already devolved into complete chaos. Gu Yuan's men seized control of the mountain gullies at lightning speed, and the bandits transformed into a bunch of headless flies, which scattered in all directions as they were joyously slaughtered by the arrows raining down from above. By the time Chang Geng caught up, Gu Yuan was once again mounting his horse, swiftly drawing a special arrow from his quiver as he did. Both bow and arrow were thick and sturdy. The bow had to have weighed dozens of kilograms and had a box the size of a thumb affixed to it. Chang Geng's eyelid jumped. The bow has a gold tank? A moment later, a burst of white steam confirmed his guess. The shaft of Gu Yuan's arrow seemed to be made of iron, and when it flew from the string, it let out a piercing streak like 20 fireworks frantically racing toward the sky. As if shot from a miniature Parhelion bow, the iron arrow sprang forth with enough force to pierce the sun and, with the clang of metal against stone that rippled throughout the entire valley, buried itself in a giant mountain boulder above that heavy armor. There was an uproar like the galloping hooves of wild horses as the gargantuan rock quaked, then fell down the mountain slope. Troops of monkeys scattered, but the bandit chief was hindered by his heavy armor and looked up a second too late. Before he could see a thing, he and his armor were buried together. Yifu, I know this one, Chang Geng smiled. Cut off the head and the body will follow? Protected at Gu Yuan's side, not a single hair on his head was out of place, even after swooping through hundreds of bandits. With his hymns flying behind him, Chang Geng looked every inch the elegant young master. Gu Yuan clicked his tongue in dissatisfaction. This is it for me. Next time I return to the capital, I'll be lucky if I have half as many young ladies throwing handkerchiefs. Just under an hour later, Gu Yuan gathered up his practically defenseless Black Iron Battalion soldiers and strutted into the bandits' den. Most of the bandits had scattered after the death of their shiny armored leader. They were intimately familiar with the terrain and disappeared as soon as they melted into the mountain forests. Gu Yuan had only a small force with him. It would be inconvenient to chase them one by one. He settled for capturing the few that hadn't run quick enough, stringing them together as they huddled like quail. Gu Yuan sat down in the bandit chief's tiger pelt seat, feeling that something was off. He stood back up and lifted the tiger pelt, then laughed. This mountain king of yours has quite a unique throne. Beneath the magnificent tiger pelt draped over it, all 4 legs of the chair had been sawed off and replaced with a pile of gold bricks topped with a wooden board. If you sit on this thing, will you start laying golden eggs? Gu Yuan quipped. Shun Yi coughed a few times, signaling to his marshal to please cut the crap. By now, Minister Sun, who had been terrified into pissing himself, had finished changing his pants and returned, looking grim and proper once again. He looked around and, realizing that this was his best opportunity, instantaneously transformed from the pathetic creature he had been when he was yelling, "You mustn't!" without end, into a stately minister of the capital. He stepped toward the prisoners and barked with righteous fury. Who gave you the courage to intercept an envoy of the court? Who ordered you to do this? Chang Geng, who had been fiddling with Gu Yuan's special bow, looked up at this and smiled. Intercepting an imperial envoy is tantamount to treason. The chief's crimes speak for themselves, but ordinary bandits might get off with some banishment and penal service. Ones as heroic as all of you, though. Chang Geng trailed off with another meaningful smile. He didn't spare the trembling bandits a glance, as if this were just an offhand remark, and turned to direct his attention elsewhere. Grinning at Gu Yuan, he asked, Yifu, this is such a good bow. May I have it? Gu Yuan waved an imperious hand. Take it. Sun Jiao paused. He had never met this 4th prince and was unsure what he intended. His first impression was of a man who didn't put on airs, who was gentle in temperament and skilled in conversation, yet wasn't especially shrewd. Now, he realized he may have been mistaken. The bandits weren't stupid. After hearing these words from Chang Geng, They at once began to beat their chests and wail. "This lowly citizen didn't know the imperial envoy had arrived. Please spare me." "It's not easy to fill our bellies on the road. In a remote place like this, we might not see a single traveler for half a month. How could we know we'd run into an imperial envoy as soon as we stepped out to work? I'm innocent. Actually, I'm not innocent at all, but I have old parents and young children. It's not like I have it easy." Sun Jiao was speechless. Just then, a Black Iron Battalion soldier marched in on rapid steps and leaned over to whisper in Gu Yuan's ear. "Sir, we've received a letter from Inspector General Kuai of Nanzhong. He heard you were harassed by bandits and has set out with 200 men from his personal guard to assist you. They will arrive in short order." Gu Yuan looked up, expressionless, and happened to meet Sun Jiao's gaze. The blood on Marshal Gu's body had yet to dry, and the sight of him frightened that momentary smugness right off Sun Jiao's face. Kuai Lantu, the Inspector General of Nanzhong, had been put in place specifically to keep Fu Zhicheng in check. He commanded his 200 elite personal guards and could deploy them as needed in a crisis. In the event of a true insurgency, although 200 personal guards alone couldn't hold off the southern border army, individuals among them stood a chance of breaking through a siege to bring word of the attack. Kuai Lantu and Fu Zhicheng were enemies forced to rub elbows on a narrow road, and both desired to force the other down a dead end. It was unlikely that this newcomer was arriving with any good intentions. "Inspector General Kuai got word the very second I broke into the bandits' nest," Gu Yuan said lightly. "He must get news even faster than the soil god of these mountains." Sun Jiao knew Kuai Lantu had misjudged the timing and appeared too soon. He hurried to say, "Marshal, I must tell you the truth. Ours should have been a secret journey, but we encountered the fourth prince on the way. How could I allow the imperial heir to expose himself to such peril? I took the liberty of notifying the Inspector General of Nanzhong and requesting assistance." "I see. Minister Suen has been very thoughtful," Chang Geng said with a smile. "But how did you know this journey would be so perilous?" With reinforcements on the way, Sun Jiao's back grew straighter. He cupped his hands and said, "Your Highness, to be honest, before setting out on this consolatory mission, I had already heard that bandits were rampant along the southern border. To prepare for all contingencies, I requested a marching orders decree from His Majesty before my departure, only for the worst to actually come to pass. How fortunate we are that the Marquis has fought countless battles and remains unflappable in the face of danger." At these words of flattery, Gu Yuan looked at him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said nothing. Sun Jiao's voice took on a sanctimonious tone. "These bandits maraud unchecked. If they are so brazen as to intercept even appointed officials of the court, how must they treat the local commoners? If we don't eliminate this scourge, the Southwest will know no peace. It seems I was right to make this request of the Emperor. This is the first marching orders decree in the history of our great Liang, and it seems the honor has fallen to General Fu." Chapter 41. Opening Moves. In addition to his 200 personal guards, Inspector General Kuai of Nanzhong had at his disposal 10 suits of heavy armor and 15 light pelts. If he added a giant kite, his forces would be no weaker in terms of armor and engines than the guard of Yanhui Town on the northern border. When he received Sun Jiao's letter, Kuai Lantu knew the day he'd waited for had finally arrived. Fu Zhicheng was a rough and arrogant character who had gotten used to life as the local tyrant. He had refused to show Kuai Lantu respect in front of others multiple times, and a grudge had long been fermenting between them. Now the emperor had his heart set on centralizing the nation's military power and enacting the marching orders decree, and His Majesty would surely need a sacrifice to his cause. The Northwest was Gu Yuan's domain, so he couldn't touch it, at least for now. Jiangnan's primary military force was its navy, which undertook the important mission of supervising merchant ships traveling to and from the far west. In addition, there were still Woku pirates stirring up trouble in the East Sea, so this area, too, was an inappropriate place to make sweeping changes. The Central Plains Army stabilized the nation for its center, so it would be the last piece to tackle, if at all. The backward hinterland of the southern border was the single remaining option for an opening move. If Fuji Chang were smart, he would hunker down on the southern border and pretend he didn't exist. But instead, he had sprung up to pressure the court under the pretense of mourning. One of Kuai Lan Tu's personal guards approached and reported in a low voice, "Sir, the kerosene has been prepared." Kuai Lan Tu accepted the field scope from the guard and surveyed the charming scene of verdant mountains laid out before him. The master of the mountain in the distance was a Taoist priest who went by the title Jing Xu. Most of the common people followed the lead of the emperor in his Buddhist faith. So not only had his Taoist temple struggled to stay open, the local ruffians had also seen him as an easy target and showed up time and again to rob him. In a fit of rage, Jingshu had beaten one of these robbers to death, and with nowhere left to go, his only option had been to turn to banditry. As someone who was both literate and ruthless, he had made quite a splash, and later became the leader of all the bandits within a few hundred kilometers worth of mountains along the southern border. Kuai Lan Tu knew Jingshu and Fuji Chang were birds of a feather. If he wanted to kill Fuji Chang, he would have to start with this Taoist priest. Kuai Lan Tu and Sun Jiao had formulated their plans long ago when the emperor first used a golden arrow token of command to summon Gu Yun to the south. They would make the first move and spread news that the court was sending an imperial envoy to investigate Fuji Chang's collusion with mountain bandits on the southern border. For his part, to make certain that no one attacked the imperial envoy, Fuji Chang was sure to warn all the great bandit chiefs about the incoming consolatory delegation and order them to keep a tight leash on their subordinates. Kuai Lan Tu and Sun Jiao were counting on this. Now, should these bandits trust General Fu about the nature of this envoy, or should they trust the rumors? If these bandit chiefs harbored the tiniest mote of doubt, what would they think when Fuji Chang tried to pass off investigators sent by the imperial court as envoys of a consolatory delegation? Just as the imperial envoy was about to cross into the southern border region, Kuai Lan Tu received Sun Jiao's letter warning of their approach. He sent a group of his men, disguised as soldiers of the southern border army, to Jingshu to tell him the entourage of the Marquis of Anding and the imperial envoy had been ambushed. Kuai Lan Tu's instructions were clear. They were to tell the bandit chief that, lest prying eyes spot the connections between General Fu and the bandits, the general could not personally intervene and therefore sought the Taoist priest's assistance. Jingshu and Fuji Chang were friends of long standing, so whether he was suspicious or not, there was no question that he would cover for Fuji Chang at such a critical juncture. Placing brotherly loyalty above all, Jingshu rushed over with his men the instant he heard the news. The minute they left, Kuai Lan Tu and his lackeys emerged from the mountainside where they'd been lying in wait and blockaded every road out of the mountain with heavy armor infantry. Thousands of arrows dipped in kerosene were knocked into bowstrings, and Jingshu's lair burned to the ground in a great blaze. At the same time, Kuai Lan Tu sent light pelt and heavy armor units to patrol the mountains and send any escapees to join their compatriots in the afterlife with a short cannon blast. Both the bandits who poured out to guard the mountain and the helpless elderly, women, and children who stayed within received the same treatment. None were spared save a few survivors intentionally left alive so they could bring Jingshu the news. Looking over at the distant mountain peak, which had now been reduced to a pile of rubble, Kuai Lan Tu stroked his whiskers and smiled in satisfaction. "That's enough. Let's go. It's time to call on Marshal Gu." With a wave of his hand, heavy armor infantrymen, light pelt cavalrymen, and 200 elite soldiers fell into formation with practiced ease and prepared to set out. Kuai Lan Tu mounted his horse and glanced back at the peak mangled by flames. Fuji Chang always said the mountain bandits were wily. Eradicable by wildfire and shooting up again after every spring breeze. He observed absently. Well, this humble official has set the wildfire, and we'll see if they shoot up again now. With that, he urged his horse on. Now every bandit in the area would see that, to save himself from the imperial envoy's investigation, Fuji Chang had launched an attack on his former brothers as a stalling measure. Kuai Lan Tu was determined to have Fuji Chang and the mountain bandits at each other's throats. Wasn't Fuji Chang the one who thought so highly of his own cunning and was so sure no one would find anything to use against him? Sun Jiao and Kuai Lan Tu had carefully plotted every detail of their plan. To guard against Fuji Chang doing something so desperate as actually rising in armed rebellion when backed into a corner, Sun Jiao invited the Marquis of Anding to personally oversee the consolatory mission. Gu Yuan had yet to reach the age of 30, and his abilities might not be sufficient to counter Fuji Chang, a regional commander who had battled his way through mountains of corpses. But whether they were or not mattered little. It just so happened that Fuji Chang owed a debt to the former Marquis of Anding for recognizing his talents and supporting his military career. Kuai Lan Tu was certain that Fuji Chang wouldn't dare touch a hair on Gu Yuan's head. Although most of the former Marquis of Anding's men had retired from the military in their old age, the influence of that complex network of relations lingered. If Fuji Chang really were so ungrateful as to attack the old Marquis's only son, the backlash from the southern border army would be more than enough to teach him a lesson. Furthermore, no matter how reckless the man might be, even he wouldn't think his insignificant southern border army had the ability to raise a rebellion and shake the foundations of Great Liang, right? Minutes after Kuai Lan Tu left the mountainside, a palm-sized wooden bird arrived. It swiveled its eyes and flapped its wings, then took off once again amid the thick smoke and crimson splashes of blood, shrinking into a small black dot before disappearing entirely. At the same time, inside the southern border garrison, Fuji Chang had just received word that the Marquis of Anding's entourage had been ambushed. Thunderstruck, he leapt to his feet and grabbed the scout by his collar. "Where is the Marquis of Anding now?" "The Marquis of Anding slaughtered his way through Apricot Grove," the scout said in a rush. "But for some reason, he remains in their lair and refuses to leave. He even swapped out their flag for the commander's banner of the Black Iron Battalion." When Fuji Chang heard this, his face twitched, and he swept all the wine glasses and teacups on the table to the floor. He spat in fury. "Those whoresons haven't done a worthwhile thing in their lives. All they know how to make is trouble." The scout was afraid to even breathe too loud. He stepped to the side, knelt down on one knee, and watched as the commander-in-chief of the southern border army paced back and forth across the room like a caged beast. Fuji Chang wasn't surprised that Gu Yuan cut down the Apricot Grove bandits. It would be a far stranger tale if he were successfully ambushed. But that still left him with the question, what was the Marquis of Anding thinking? Why did he stay at Apricot Grove, rather than hurry along on his journey? If he was staying only to interrogate the bandits, why swap out the flag? Was he waiting for someone? Was he waiting to do something? Not to mention, Gu Yuan's official reason for coming south was to offer condolences to a general in mourning. So why had he brought the commander's banner of the Black Iron Battalion? If the commander's banner was here, was the Black Iron Tiger Tally here too? Did he really bring only a handful of guards and a useless assistant minister? Some 100 kilometers from here, that Inspector General of Nanzhong had without a doubt prepared a full bucket of mud to smear on him. Had Gu Yuan made contact with him ahead of time? As it stood, Fuji Chang couldn't tell which side Gu Yuan was on. His eyelid began to twitch. Although he had indeed served under the former Marquis of Anding, he hadn't interacted with Gu Yuan much over the years. He knew well that Gu Yuan disapproved of his involvement with the bandits. Fuji Chang couldn't begin to guess the true reason for Gu Yuan's visit. "Saddle the horses." Fuji Chang broke the silence. "The Mountain Tiger, White Wolf, and Spirit Fox divisions come with me. We will go see the Marquis of Anding and the Imperial Envoy. The Forest Leopard will gear up and await orders. Watch for smoke. That will be your signal to move in. Be prepared to march at a moment's notice." The scouts stared at Fujicheng in shock. With this, General Fu had mustered almost half the southern border army. Were they planning to behold the Marquis of Anding or besiege him? Pulling a long halberd off the wall in one smooth motion, Fujicheng barked, "What are you waiting for?" 3/4 of an hour later, the southern border army's forces set off for Apricot Grove. There was no going back now. As night deepened over the official road through the southern border, merchant caravans that had missed the chance to stop at an inn set up temporary camps at the side of the road. These itinerant merchants traveled throughout the land and were used to roughing it in the wild. They left a single night guard with a burning torch to watch as the rest dropped off to sleep. At the third night watch, the lilting call of a cuckoo sounded from inside the forest. The night guard and several merchants who had only been pretending to sleep stood up one by one. They exchanged no words, but communicated with their eyes as they brushed past each other, then slunk behind the wagons without a sound. These wagons had secret compartments built into them. After the men shoved aside the goods piled on top, they lifted a board to reveal the hidden cargo beneath, cold armor that reflected no glint of light. In small groups of 3 to 5, these nocturnal travelers swiftly donned the steel armor. Among them were hawks, carapaces, and even some light-pelt cavalrymen. Then they turned and disappeared into the night, dispersing in all directions. The rustling of the forest as they departed startled a few sleeping birds awake, but within minutes all returned to stillness. Only the points of lights from the merchants' caravan torches remained, scattering over the darkness like a handful of gold pieces strewn across the southern border's mountainous terrain. Under the cover of night, multiple unseen forces, each with motives of their own, sped toward Apricot Grove. The Apricot Grove bandit chief, crushed beneath that giant boulder, had never in his wildest dreams imagined that his singular, stupid decision would become the spark that lit the fuse of the southern border. Inside the bandit lair within Apricot Grove, the bandits under Sun Jiao's interrogation doubled down on their story. They had no idea the imperial envoy was coming. The assistant minister spun his wheels for half a day with little to show for it. Defeated, he was left with nothing to do but sit, eyes drifting toward the door again and again. Gu Yuan took a few bites of food, then wiped his mouth and set down his chopsticks. Watching Sun Jiao, who looked so antsy he may as well have been sitting on a bed of nails, he laughed. Assistant Minister Sun, you've looked at the door 7 or 8 times since we sat down to eat. Do you really miss Inspector General Kuai that much? Sun Jiao cycled through several expressions before molding his face into an ingratiating smile. Marshal, don't be absurd. Is the food not to your taste? Why don't you have some more? I'll pass. Gu Yuan shot him a pointed look. Overeating slows one's movements. This is plenty. All right, Jiping, if you have nothing else to do, count up all the gold and silver in this bandit lair. If we're going to the trouble to rob bandits, we can't end up with nothing to show for it. Pack it up and take it with us. Sun Jiao stared. Gu Yuan turned back to him with a smile. Assistant Minister Sun, you won't impeach me when you get back, will you? To be honest with you, given how stingy the Ministry of War is these days, times have been tough for the Black Iron Battalion, he said with a sigh. The trussed-up bandits were quick on the uptake, and when they heard this, they hurried to speak. We have account books. We do. They're up there. Shun Yi turned to look where they pointed and found that this place even came with its own semi-secret hideaway. A tall ladder stood in the corner leading straight up to the ceiling, where a pile of hay concealed a small attic constructed on top of the rafters. Great, Shun Yi thought. I've once again become the accountant of a chicken coop. It was at that moment that Kuai Lantu arrived at Apricot Grove. Kuai Lantu strutted in with his personal guards in tow. The scent of blood and fire on him had yet to disperse, shrouding him in a murderous aura. He stepped forward and announced in a booming voice, This lower official, Kuai Lantu, Inspector General of Nanzhong, greets the Marquis of Anding, Assistant Minister Sun, all the generals, and this... Chang Geng smiled at him. Li Min. Kuai Lan Tu trailed off. Sun Jiao hurried to remind him in a low voice. Show some respect. That's Prince Yanbei, His Highness the Fourth Prince. Kuai Lan Tu started in surprise. Li Min, the emperor's youngest brother, had never shown himself before the eyes of the world. Most people only knew that he had once been lost among the commoners. After he was found, he kept to himself deep within the Marquis of Anding's estate and rarely left. He was rather young and had no achievements to speak of. What was Commandery Prince Yanbei doing here? As if Prince Yanbei's sudden appearance was some ill portent, Kuai Lan Tu's eye twitched fiercely. But before he could respond, one of his personal guards hurried inside and whispered in his ear. Inspector General Kuai, said Gu Yun, how precious the spittle of your subordinates must be. May we not even listen? Kuai Lan Tu kicked the personal guard away. Insolent! To whisper in front of the Marquis and His Highness! Unthinkable! Even after suffering a solid kick, the guard's face showed no resentment. He dropped to one knee without hesitation and reported, My lords, tens of thousands of soldiers are marching toward Apricot Grove. It appears to be the Southern Border Army. The words had barely left his mouth when an unfamiliar vanguard captain arrived on the slopes of the mountain. The Inspector General's personal guards raised swords, spears, and halberds as if they were trying to light up the night with the cold gleam of their blades. The vanguard captain, however, showed no sign of fear. He called out, Fu Zhicheng, governor of the Southwest, leads his troops to welcome the marshal. Gu Yuan's face was impassive as he thought to himself, This Fu fellow really knows how to seek his own demise. Kuai Lan Tu sneaked another surreptitious look at Chang Geng. The fourth prince offered him a smile, then turned, unhurried, and ascended the ladder in the corner, disappearing up into the attic where the account books were stored. Kuai Lan Tu saw his chance and stepped forward. Marshal, this lower official has something to report. Gu Yuan looked back up at him. As the defending general of this region, Fu Zhicheng has neglected his duties and colluded with local bandits. He treats the peasants like livestock and conspires with foreign nations to the south. His traitorous intentions are clear. Marshal, you must be prepared. Oh, is that so? Gu Yuan did not look at all surprised to hear such accusations. He spun his worn prayer beads around his fingertip a few times, as if lost in thought. After a beat, he said, Well then, let's invite him up. I would like to see exactly how he plans to commit treason. Kuai Lan Tu and Sun Jiao looked at each other, both suspecting their ears had malfunctioned. Gu Yun repeated, I said, let's invite General Fu up here. Do the two of you have some objection? Chang Geng had climbed into the attic and found that it was quite a change of scene from the dim lair down below. The small space had a window and even a skylight, through which he had an excellent view of the mountain below. The Apricot Grove bandits had previously raised their flag right above the skylight. Shen Yi had set up a tall torch off to the side, and Chang Geng found him burning some unknown substance that released a pillar of white smoke, which rose straight into the sky without being diffused by the wind. Chang Geng smiled. I thought General Shen was here to examine the accounts and came up to lend a hand. It turns out he came up here to light a smoke signal instead. Shen Yi leapt down from the skylight. Your Highness, you understand accounting too? He asked with interest. What have you been up to all these years? Nothing much. I studied medicine with Miss Chun for a while, and sometimes ran some errands for my Jianghu friends. I've also joined up with merchant caravans here and there. I've learned a bit of everything. It was an obvious non-answer, but Shen Yi tactfully asked no further. A person couldn't fake experience or knowledge. No matter how a green youth might work to put on an act of composure, those who were observant would see the cracks in their facade. Chang Geng's experience traveling to Jianghu could not have been so simple, or he never would have acquired such an enigmatic aura. As he was now, he was impossible to read. Chang Geng pushed open the attic window and looked out. A grand procession of troops snaked their way up the mountain, their commander's banner whipping in the wind like a ship's sail. Their armor gleamed coldly under the glow of the torches, and a cloud of steam rose from their ranks and wound down the mountain for kilometers, like a living, breathing dragon. Fuji Chang had commanded the southern border army for nearly 10 years and was all but a local tyrant on the southern border. If he had brought a few hundred soldiers to slay bandits and welcome the imperial envoy today, he would have room to explain and maneuver. But the man had actually dragged half the southern border army out for this errand. Chang Geng watched the procession for a while, then sighed. Yifu may have been inclined to protect General Fu at the start, but now it will be difficult to do so. He has not only failed to appreciate this favor, it looks like he's coming here to throw down the gauntlet. Shen Yi gazed curiously at Chang Geng's serene profile. Your Highness has the demeanor of a seasoned general, steady in the face of danger, and at such a young age. You are a rare talent indeed. It comes with experience, Chang Geng said evenly. Back when I infiltrated the EC rebels' lair with Yifu, I truly had no confidence that we would make it through. That time, those of us at his side were more burden than help, and we had no idea when the Navy would finally arrive. Nor did we know if they would receive the letter we sent en route in the first place. Yet he still laughed with ease, as he always does, and we made it out in one piece. I learned something back then. What? There's no point in being afraid. Shen Yi thought for a moment, then shook his head with a smile. Well, of course, everyone knows that there's no point in being afraid, but it's just like how everyone gets hungry at mealtimes and cold without clothes. It's a natural reaction of the body. How can someone suppress the reactions of their own body? A faint smile appeared on Chang Geng's face. It's possible. Shen Yi blinked in surprise. He suddenly had a vague feeling that quite a lot was hidden within Chang Geng's "it's possible." It is my belief that, as long as you are willing, there's nothing in this world that can defeat you, not even your own flesh and bones, Chang Geng said in a soft voice. These words sounded ordinary, but Chang Geng's expression and tone as he said them were too resolute. So resolute that they were oddly bewitching, in a way that made others unconsciously believe them too. Your Highness, when you and the Marshal were trapped in the EC, you still had some dozen experts from the Lin Yuan Pavilion at your side. It was a collaboration from within and without, but this time is different. We only have Assistant Minister Sun, who has his heart set on advancing the marching orders decree, and Inspector General Kwai, who is harboring his own ulterior motives. Fuji Chang is about to fight his way up the mountain with the thousands of soldiers under his command. Isn't the situation even more desperate than last time? Your Highness, are you not worried? Chang Geng flashed him a self-possessed smile. I'm not worried. Seeing the commander's banner of the Black Iron Battalion flying above this attic, I feel as if there are 3,000 Black Iron Divine Cavalry hidden within these southwestern forests. I can't help but feel assured. Taken aback, Shen Yi laughed awkwardly and pressed his hand to his forehead. He broke out in a cold sweat on Gu Yuan's behalf. Their little highness certainly lived up to his bloodline. As the descendant of imperial dragons, he was quite a handful. Besides, Chang Geng spoke up again, General Shen knows too, right? That my Yifu might not be dead set on saving Fuji Chang? Shen Yi was speechless. He actually didn't know that part. Chapter 42. Onset of Chaos. Kuai Lan Tu's personal guards obeyed the order to make way for the southern border army, but they did not sheathe their weapons. They left Fuji Chang a narrow, blade-studded path up the mountain. Bandit Fu also dropped all pretenses of subtlety. He brought more than 100 of his elite soldiers with him, each and every one armed to the teeth. They marched in 2 long columns, bearing their blades to ward off the personal guards flanking them. Both sides clashed the whole way up, and Fuji Chang gritted his teeth and pushed his way through amid the clamor of metal on metal. He didn't look like he was coming to beg for forgiveness, but rather like he intended to arrest and interrogate Gu Yue. The remaining southern border army soldiers surrounded Apricot Grove in a solid wall, glaring menacingly up toward the mountain's peak. Kuai Lan Tu clenched his jaw. He hadn't expected such audacity from Chang. This man didn't even perform the most basic niceties before charging straight in with weapons drawn, disregarding completely the presence of the Marquis of Order. Chang charged up the mountain like a wild storm and appeared at the peak in a gust of thick bloodlust. Sun Jiao, acting as the guard dog, bore the brunt of his initial attack, and, in his hasty retreat, accidentally trod on one of the tied-up bandits lying on the ground. The bandit yelped, and the ferocity of this cry made the pair of chopsticks Assistant Minister Sun used for legs grow weak with fear. Chang had yet to open his mouth, but the opposing side had already suffered one casualty. Chang Geng looked down from the attic with clear interest. "I remember now," he said to the stupefied Shen Yi. Shen Yi's ears perked up. Assistant Minister Sun's younger sister from his father's primary wife married Imperial Uncle Wang as his second wife after he became a widower. What is the emperor thinking, allowing his uncle's brother-in-law to meet the Ministry of War? Isn't it more punishment than reward to make the man deal with a bunch of dissatisfied generals all day? Your Highness, Shen Yi said carefully, you said just now that the marshal might not be set on saving Chang. Could you please enlighten me? Chang Geng shot him a sidelong glance. Why else would we remain in this bandit stronghold? If he had his heart set on protecting Chang, he would have already hastened to the southern border camp to interrogate him. Shen Yi was silent. In all honesty, he had wondered about Gu Yuan's decision as well, but he had been accustomed to trusting Gu Yuan unconditionally for many years. He thought Gu Yuan still had another card up his sleeve. I'd guess that when Yifu saw these lawless bandits blocking our way, he was already beginning to weigh the pros and cons. If Chang had appeared in person to confess his crimes, Yifu may have considered letting him off out of respect for his years of labor and service. But now... Chang Geng chuckled. It isn't a crime to be greedy, cunning, or even foolish. But Chang should never have openly challenged the Black Iron Battalion. The Black Iron Battalion was the product of 3 generations of painstaking effort. Regardless of whether the nation's true military power rested in the hands of the Emperor or Gu Yuan, every day the glory of the Black Iron Battalion persisted was another day Great Liang maintained at least a superficial degree of security. A public challenge to the Black Iron Battalion was an attempt to shake the foundations of the nation. This alone was intolerable to Gu Yuan. Below, Chang gazed at Gu Yuan in silence. It seemed that he still retained some small measure of reason, for he returned his sword to its scabbard and dipped into a bow. It has been many years since we last met. I'm glad to see Marshal Gu safe and sound after all this time. Seeing Chang bow his head, his guards sheathed their own weapons and arrayed themselves behind him in a loyal wall of flesh. The tension in the room eased at once. Kuai Lan too and Sun Jiao both inwardly cheered. Bringing Gu Yuan here had been the correct move after all. Yet, after watching Gu Yuan stare at Chang for a moment, they never expected his next words. I haven't been entirely safe, General Fu. Inspector General Kuai has just informed me that as the governor of the Southwest, you have colluded with local bandits and conspired with foreign nations to the south, with clear intent to commit treason. What do you think of this? No one expected Gu Yuan to be even blunter than Chang. With the southern border army knocking at the mountain's door, he didn't mince words, and instead interrogated the man outright. The atmosphere thickened once again. Up in the attic, however, Chang Geng was relaxed. He seemed quite fond of the bow Gu Yuan had given him. It weighed several dozen kilograms, yet he hadn't put it down for a single second. He hadn't strapped it to his back earlier, and now he unshouldered it and held it in his hands, carefully wiping it down with a handkerchief he had produced from who knows where. Shen Yi thought for a second. But if he intends to give up Chang, won't he have no choice but to watch as His Majesty pushes through the marching orders decree? General Shen, Chang Geng said placidly, haven't you considered this before? Even rural farmers know that once the marching orders decree goes into effect, it will divide the military power invested in Yifu's Black Iron Tiger Tally. All the regional commanders oppose it. So why won't he say a word against it? Why? Shen Yi found himself asking. Because he grew up with His Majesty, and he understands His Majesty's headstrong nature better than anyone else. Every day the marching orders decree is delayed is a day His Majesty is unable to personally control the nation's military power, a day he'll fail to eat and fail to sleep. Opposing it will merely intensify the conflict within the court, and the most Yifu will achieve will be to turn lord and subject against each other, leaving an opening for vile characters to gain his coveted position. He must make this compromise eventually. It's only a question of how. Chang Geng's last words were drowned out by a furious shout from below. Kuai Lan Tu had made his move right before Gu Yuan's eyes. Kuai Lan Tu wasn't as timid as Sun Jiao. The moment Gu Yuan spoke, he knew this wasn't going to end well. Either he or Fu Zhicheng would die in Apricot Grove today. The southern border army stood ready at the foot of the mountain, and the more words he wasted here, the faster his demise. He might as well capture this Fu bastard before he had the chance to act. No matter how many southern border army soldiers waited at the foot of the mountain, without their leader, wouldn't they be lambs to the slaughter? Kuai Lan Tu had made a snap decision to go over Gu Yuan's head. He pointed at Fu Zhicheng and shouted, "Arrest the traitors!" The Inspector General's personal guards, who had been on a hair trigger since they entered the bandits' lair, surged forward at his command. Chang Geng sneered. He took a heavy iron arrow from his quiver and slowly drew his bow from where he stood in the attic. A thin trail of white steam hissed from the bow tip and puffed against the side of his face. As the condensation beaded on his jade-like skin, he looked all the more handsome and gentle. Shen Yi was privately shocked. This bow had been custom-made for Gu Yuan, and even though it was equipped with a gold tank and allowed it to achieve the effect of a Parhelion bow, it was still far too heavy for any normal person to draw. Chang Geng was no more than 20, yet when he drew the bow and took aim, his arms were as steady as stone, without the slightest tremble. This young highness had been doing far more than keeping up with his martial training. Even if the marshal did intend to compromise, Shen Yi ventured, who would be left to clean up the mess on the southern border in General Fu's place? What do you mean? Shen Yi ran down the list of all major and minor military generals in service. The newly appointed Jiangnan Army and Navy Commander Zhao Youfang is relatively competent, but aside from him, the others aren't up to the task. We may not be short on fierce generals, but the position of commander-in-chief of the entire region requires more than just combat ability. Both experience and a record of service are a must. And they'll need to hold their own against both local powers and those useless idiots in the Ministry of War. His Majesty can't very well dump a naval commander into the southern border's mountain ranges, can he? Chang Geng laughed, but his gaze remained fixed on the scene unfolding below. Fu Zhicheng wasn't going to let himself be arrested without a fight, and the seasoned general of the southern border indeed lived up to his valiant reputation. With one sweep of his sword, he took off a man's head and turned to face the charge of a guard in heavy armor head-on. He made no move to dodge, swinging his sword to meet the attacks, then leapt up, landed with one foot on the heavy armor's shoulder, and flipped in midair. 3 of his southern border army soldiers charged after him, the heel ropes they carried snaking out like whips to ensnare the heavy armor between them. Fu Zhicheng and the steel machinery let out twin roars. The general gripped his iron sword in both hands and slashed down, the blade finding with fatal precision the chink in the heavy armor's nape and severing the head of the soldier inside. The heavy armor took one last stiff step and fell still. Only then did blood start flowing from the armor in streams. Fu Zhicheng sat atop the heavy armor's shoulders and wiped blood from his face. He turned his hawk-like glare toward Kuai Lan Tu. Kuai Lan Tu finally took an involuntary step back. At that moment, an arrow streaked down from above with force enough to shoot down the sun, slicing through the air with a shriek that rang through the bandit lair. Fu Zhicheng's pupils contracted, but it was too late. The arrow brushed the top of Kuai Lang Tu's black official's hat, bursting it into two halves with the force of its passage. Shaken from its bun, his hair spilled down like an unkempt ghost. The arrow had yet to reach the end of its flight. It punched straight through the chest of the heavy armor, pulverizing the sheet of iron on both sides before nailing itself to the ground with no loss of momentum. Rocked by the force of the impact, Fujichang tumbled from his perch. The ground around the arrow's landing site exploded, leaving only a pit behind. The three southern border army soldiers simultaneously leapt back. The arrow had embedded itself perfectly at the intersection of their heel ropes. The knock of the arrow was still trembling with the force of its impact, buzzing like a hornet's nest. How impertinent, Chang Geng muttered under his breath. Beneath the shocked gazes of everyone in the room, he drew a second iron arrow and knocked it to the string. At the same time, he quietly continued his conversation with Shen Yi. General Shen, don't forget, there is still one more person. Shen Yi was still deep in shock at his breathtaking shot. It took him several seconds to find his voice again. Forgive me, I am unable to recall anyone else. So close, yet so far. What? Shen Yi blurted out in shock. The corners of Chang Geng's eyes curved in a smile. Yes, I mean you. Down below, Gu Yuan's face was devoid of his usual easy confidence. His taut features made him seem especially cold. Kuai Lan Tu, I have been meaning to ask you a question. Where did you find the guts to keep so many private soldiers? Kuai Lan Tu's face was ashen as the buzz of that iron arrow echoed in his ear. Unsure whose side Gu Yuan was on, he began to panic. Marshal, there are things you don't know. Because the Inspector General of Nanzhong works on the border, the court granted me special permission to maintain a guard to protect against mob uprisings. Gu Yuan wouldn't be put off. With the exception of His Majesty's Imperial Guard, no guard detail is permitted steam-powered armor with firepower greater than light-pelt cavalry. Even the heavy armor used by the Imperial Guard is not allowed gold tanks over 60 centimeters in size. Kuai Lan Tu, whose memory is failing, yours or mine? Kuai Lan Tu sucked in a sharp breath. Of course he knew he was breaking the rules, but while this infraction wasn't a minor one, neither was it especially major. Someone could make a fuss about it and write a nasty impeachment against him. But if he could take out Fujichang and make way for the marching orders decree to be enacted, it would be but an unfortunate footnote to a great achievement easily forgotten. Now that he had come this far, there was no going back. Kuai Lang Tu clenched his fist and returned fire with some insinuations of his own. My lord, with a traitor to the nation before us, is it really the time to be quibbling over the specifications of my guard detail? A slight frown creased Gu Yuan's brow, as if he were unused to arguing face to face. Kuai Lan Tu didn't miss this fleeting change in his expression. Now that he had thrown caution to the wind, Inspector General Kuai found that the legendary Marquis of Anding wasn't so scary after all. He was merely a young man with high status. What was Gu Yuan without the former Marquis's people behind him? On the other side, Fujichang roared with fury. You bastard! Who are you calling a traitor to the nation? Kuai Lan Tu raised his voice. Everyone! We have been surrounded by the rebel army. Our only option now is to capture their leader before they have time to react. My lords, I hope you will control your subordinates and show you will not tolerate treason. Fujichang was so angry he could only laugh. He had an ugly face, and his laughter made him look still more like a wicked devil. Capture me? I'd like to see you try. Fujichang's personal guards moved fast. They surged forward and charged into the main hall to bring a close-quarters fight to the Inspector General's guard. Apricot Grove's tiny bandit nest was shortly packed full of armor and weaponry. Why was Gu Yuan still feigning cowardice, merely watching the commotion? Shen Yi didn't understand. The earth-shattering din of battle cries spurred him to action, and he made to jump down from the attic. But as soon as he turned, he saw that young prince's unaffected expression. His arrow's aim never strayed from Gu Yuan. If anyone should get too close, he would skewer them on the spot. General Shan, don't worry, I'm keeping an eye on things. Chang Geng's voice held a subtle yet unquestionable conviction. A terrifying thought crossed Shen Yi's mind. Was Gu Yuan deliberately arousing the bad blood between Fu Zhicheng and Kuai Lan Tu to kill by the hand of another? And before Shen Yi had figured it out himself, the fourth prince had already seen through it? If Fu Zhicheng is captured today, the position of commander-in-chief of the southern border will be vacant, Chang Geng said calmly. His Majesty may be stubborn, but he understands where his priorities lie. An important region like the border needs a senior officer to guard it. And across all the court, no one is more qualified than you, General Shen. His Majesty is only undermining my Yifu's military power because his paranoia runs too deep. There is still affection between them from growing up together, and the security of Great Liang still rests on my Yifu's shoulders. Once the marching orders decree is enacted, the Black Iron Tiger tally will be an empty symbol. No matter who becomes commander-in-chief on the southern border, they will have only administrative and not true military power. Yifu has already made his stance clear. Isn't it only right for His Majesty to offer his marshal a sweet to soothe the pain of this beating? Chang Geng paused, then smiled. General Shen, consider this. Even though His Majesty has little fondness for me, his discount younger brother, he wouldn't reduce the yearly reward he grants me by a single coin. Although, it's even more than Yifu's annual salary. Shen Yi set aside the complicated question of who, exactly, was the Marquis Estate's breadwinner for the time being, and looked at Chang Geng in shock. Several expressions flickered across his face. Finally, he sighed. Your Highness, you truly have changed. The teenager they had brought back from the small town of Yanhui was pure and stubborn, every emotion worn on his sleeve. Shen Yi had inwardly applauded his tenacity of spirit many times. Any normal child who transformed from a country bumpkin into a prince overnight would have long been spellbound by the splendor of the capital city. But now, this young man, who spoke passionately to him about the direction of the nation in the middle of pitched battle, had shed all the tenderness of youth. The extent of his transformation was frightening. Chang Geng didn't reply. For the last 4 years, he hadn't dared let up on training either his body or his mind for a single day. It wasn't because he wanted to accomplish great things. It was because he wanted to become strong as quickly as possible. Strong enough, one day, to exchange witty repartee with the Wu Arge. Strong enough to protect a certain person. Our nation's greatest difficulty right now is a lack of money, Chang Geng said. Although our ports are open, the Central Plains people rarely make sea voyages, and our coastal defense is lacking. We depend on the Westerners to travel back and forth and bring commerce to us. The Western merchants who make the trip reap the big profits, and the silver that trickles into our coffers isn't enough for His Majesty to spend secretly buying the Westerners' violet gold. That's true, Shen Yi agreed. But this is only a temporary situation. There are a number of ways to remedy it. Chang Geng laughed. That night, this spring, I visited the Silk Road. The entrance of the Silk Road in Lolan is so prosperous, it fills one with awe. And when I thought of how my Yifu had fostered this growth with his own hands, I, too, was filled with pride. In another 3 years, at most, the Silk Road will be fully connected and span the breadth of Great Liang. Once the common people profit from the trade it brings, gold and silver will flow into the national treasury. The Lingshu Institute won't have to fret over funding. There will be plenty of money for military salaries, and with a strong army, who would dare to invade? By then, it won't matter to my Yifu who is in charge, himself or the Ministry of War. Shen Yi fell silent. He didn't understand how, after a 4-year separation, Chang Geng understood Gu Yuan better than before. Everything he said was true. A few years ago, Gu Yuan had oozed bloodlust, always privately muttering about how he'd beat up this or that person. Yet ever since he took charge of the Silk Road, he said these things less often. Part of it was that, as he grew older, he began to think more and lose his temper less. But another part was that Gu Yuan had never wanted to cling to military power in the first place. What point was there in swaggering about like that? The only thing he wanted in life was peace for his nation. If this could be achieved in battle, he would don his armor. But if defense was all that was needed, he was also willing to be a poor and humble guard along the trade routes. Watching Shen Yi lost in thought, Chang Geng recalled hearing someone say that no one could get between a general and his mechanic. Such was the trust and understanding between them. A hint of sour envy creeped into his heart, but before he could finish brewing this vinegar, there came a flutter of wings and a bird landed on the windowsill. Chang Geng started, and then put aside his bow and arrow. The bird obediently flew over and perched on his palm. Upon closer inspection, it was fashioned of wood, though exquisitely lifelike in construction. The movements of its neck were cute and clever, not unlike a living creature. Shen Yi was a former member of the Lingshu Institute, and the way his hands itched at the sight of machinery was a chronic condition. Upon seeing the bird, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. He all but fidgeted with greed, but had no good reason to ask Chang Geng for the little machine. Chang Geng lightly tapped a particular rhythm into the bird's stomach, and the panel sprang open to reveal a roll of paper inside. When Chang Geng read its contents, a shift came over the immovable calm of his face. "What is it?" Below, Gu Yuan spotted a flash of light out of the corner of his eye. He raised his arm and placed his hand, slender and pretty as a noble's son, on the sword that hung at his waist. A small southern border soldier had sprung up and charged at Kuai Lan Tu. Gu Yuan's black iron guard rushed to his aid, but before Kuai Lan Tu could react, the soldier opened his mouth and spat something out. The inspector general turned to dodge, instincts sounding the alarm, but it was already too late. Whew. A blow dart the size of a finger buried itself in his neck. At the same time, the black iron guard's sword slashed down on the southern border soldier's head, as if the man hadn't seen the blow dart flying toward Inspector General Kuai at all. Kuai Lan Tu's throat spasmed, and he raised his hands as if to grasp something. But within a split second, both assassin and mark had lost their lives. Sun Jiao hadn't expected this mishap. He stepped back and crashed into the wall behind him with a clatter, petrified. Then, with a shriek that pierced the skies, half of the high ceiling of the bandits' nest burst open. Countless Black Hawks swooped down onto the scene. Kuai Lan Tu and Sun Jiao had plotted to use Gu Yuan to force Fuzhi Cheng into rebellion, but Gu Yuan had refused to follow their plans. He had exacerbated the conflict before they could make their move, goaded Fuzhi Cheng into killing Kuai Lan Tu, and produced the Black Iron Battalion, which had somehow infiltrated the southern border to handle Fuzhi Cheng. He had deployed troops with good reason and killed two birds with one stone. But something was wrong. Chang Geng dashed down from the attic. This wasn't over yet. Now that he thought about it, the one who started all of this wasn't Kuai Lan Tu, the Ministry of War, Sun Jiao, or even Gu Yuan. Okay, we have made it through chapters 40 through 41, and my body is feeling it now. So I'm going to make this as quick as possible. I only have two things to say. One, when it was talking about, like, when Shen Yi's thoughts were going through about how Gu Yuan never really wanted military power in the first place and would rather, just live a normal life of peace, essentially. It got me thinking about life in general. In the Danmei books, yes, for a lot of people who have power in the army, like Mo Xi and Yu, but also just in real life. And please correct me if I'm wrong, if you know people who do, but I don't think anyone dreams of war, or I don't think anyone dreams of being in the military. Maybe a child looking at their parent who's in the military at a young age might be like, oh, that's so cool. My father or my mother is defending the country. I want to be just like them. But I think with that naivety lessens when a person gets older. Again, I could be wrong, but I'm just wondering about it and thought it was a curious thing. I don't think people dream of being in the military or dream of going to war. It's more so just like a thing of I'm willing because I love my country or I love my people or whatever, and I want to protect that. So if war is necessary, much like Guyun, they're willing to do it. The other thing that I wanted to say, which I haven't done this since I think one time in Thousand Autumns, is a little Chinese saying, which we have it in English, of course, that's, killing two birds with one stone. They say it as well in Mandarin, but instead of saying kill two birds with one stone, they just say two birds, one stone. And so I thought maybe someone would be interested in knowing how to say that. So it's yi shi er niao. So yi is one, shi is the short way of saying shi tou, which is stone. Er is two, and niao is bird. So yi shi, one stone, er niao, two birds. Yi shi er niao. Not really sure if anyone wanted to learn that, but yeah, I just thought I'd share that. All right, that's enough for me. I'm going to go lie down. I'll see you all next time. And 我爱你们.